Welcome everybody at the Q&A session of De nos frères, blessés, in English, of our wounded brothers. You all have been watching this beautiful movie. My name is Onno Warns and I'm the the coordinator of the in-depth program of Movies That Matter Festival. And I'm a historian myself. That's not really of importance, but my fellow speaker here on the table is an historian, so that's just to set things straight. I will have a conversation with historian Stef Scagliola in the context of this movie about the independent movements in French Algeria and the Dutch East Indies, or as we call it, Indonesia. And we are looking for the diversity in the public image on colonial wars. You just saw the movie, so we have a common ground to start off from. And this session will last about 30 to 45 minutes at the most. So enjoy. Stef, who are you, and could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm a historian. I was educated and trained in the Netherlands, but my surname reveals my origin, which is Italian. And I've always been fascinated by uneasy truths. So this brought me to write a PhD on the Dutch debate on war crimes that were committed by Dutch military during the Indonesian Independence War. So I did that quite some time ago. And since then, I have published various articles and I've done some very different things that have to do with digital history and with oral history. And in after the PhD, together with a team, I created an oral history archive with 1,000 interviews with a representative sample of all the military who were involved either in conflicts or in NATO or UN military missions. So I am very much acquainted to the discourse of war and irregular warfare and the difference between the inside story at the micro level and how it is perceived by the general public. That's a continuous tension.
That seems like a good fit to this conversation.
Yes, I think so.
You've seen the movie as well. What is your first reaction?
Well, I thought it was a beautiful movie. I was really moved by it. And I think the actors are very perform their role very well, and it was a love story and a war with the war on the background, and two things struck me as standing that stood out for me, which is a Pied Noir who is sentenced to death. A Pied Noir is a concept, a name that is given to French people who are native to Algeria, but they don't have an Arab background, but they have they belong to the French colonial stratum of society. So they're called Pied Noir, black feet. Yeah. That is a general. So you would, it's in general, the Pied Noir had the vision of the independence being not welcome because it would deprive them of their privileged position. So this key figure in the film is exceptional as he is member of that society, although also member of the Communist Party. And he joins the independence movement and is prepared to do subversive acts of resistance. And without killing anybody, he's sentenced to death. And his appeal for a pardon is rejected by someone who is seen as the beacon of democracy and stableness, which is Francois Mitterrand.
I would like to come to that in a minute. Thank you. And you say Algeria and these Pieds Noirs, they were French born there. What are the specifics about Algeria as a colony, could you elaborate on that?
Yes. Well, we've together with a colleague, a British colleague, she's specialist in Algeria, Natalia Vince, we have fleshed out the differences between the Indonesian context and the Algerian context. And what is essential is that if you look at Algeria, France and Algeria, it's a kind of pressure cooker. They're only there in 1830, and they kind of try to replicate France in Algeria. So it's part and parcel of the nation. It's France. This means that families go there. So men with their wives, with their children, go there and settle there. In Indonesia, the story goes back to the 16th century, and it's a commercial interest. And they come into a country with an existing feudalic structure, and they accommodate to this structure in order to commerce. And the first 2 centuries, only men from the Netherlands went to the colony. So they chose a local partner as women. And this created a whole stratus of in between. And this meant that the relations, men and the Dutch, only started replicating their country into the colony at the end of the 19th century with the industrialization and at the beginning of the... So only then did the Dutch kind of became detached from the local culture. Before that, there was a whole mingling group. Yeah. And so this meant that the position of ethnic women, colonized women in the Netherlands, in Indonesia, was very different than the one in Algeria.
So let's stick to Algeria right now for a bit because of the movie, and then we come to the comparisons between Algeria and Indonesia. Yes. So what scene stood out for you and why? I think you referred to it already.
Well, I was. You mean the one in which he's condemned for the?
I think you said François Mitterrand.
Yes. I was really struck by that event, by that decision, and at the same time I realized that within the scholarly realm of French, this will be known. At the same time, it is striking.
What do we see?
We see a court, and we see some images of representatives who try to defend them, which are talking to the judicial authorities, and we see that it's rejected.
And what's stood out for me is that it's a court martial. It's not a civil court. Yeah. So that they brought it before a court martial.
Even if he was a civilian, he was an ordinary civilian. Exactly. He was not a conscript. No. He was not a professional military. He was just a civilian working in a company.
Yeah.
And but they have the law of the military law because it's in a, it's not a war, and at the same time it is a war. Exactly. So they have exceptional laws.
Exactly. And then you were referring to the role of François Mitterrand, who was the beacon of democracy in Europe. Or
well, it's not. It's. I remember him. I remember an icon, an image, an icon. It's him and Kohl standing next to each other, holding hands.
Brandenburger Tor.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah, it was, you don't have to be afraid of France and Germany, of the rivalry. Yeah. We are for peace. And there was he had a very strong public appeal. So the fact that I'm surprised by this characterizes the difference between knowledge within a specific scholarly realm and the public knowledge around it. Yeah. And although I'm a scholar in that field, you see that I'm surprised by this.
Yeah, because he is the Minister of
Justice.
Justice, and the appeal is brought before him, and then he rejects it on the basis of it's a threat for France, it's a threat for our. I found it striking that they use. I think it's the what do you call it, the public.
Prosecutor?
The prosecutor who says we have. It's not only about setting an example for criminals here in France, in Algeria, but it's also about losing face. In France can't afford to lose face in the public eye.
Yeah, and in that respect, I'm curious to know the historical details, because in the film, and that is subject to what you need to create a film, it's clear-cut injustice.
Yeah,
In reality, it's messier.
yeah. Reality is always messy, huh?
Yes, reality is always messy, and this is where the historians come in, and usually they say, oh, you think this way, but that's not entirely correct because it's much more complicated. And there you have to, you are warned when someone says it's too complicated, because it is, and at the same time, the sentence "it's too complicated" is also a strategy for not acknowledging the principle of justice. You say, I'm a historian. I can't say anything, and I'm very much against it. I think you have to stand for something.
I totally agree. It would be another debate. I think we have to organize that, because of course there's a lot of topics in movies that matter which refer to this. But what would be the historical facts we see in the movie which stand out, which we can agree on, and which are the historical facts in relation to this moral injustice?
Well, first of all, you see the attitude of the military authorities, of the police authorities towards the local population. That's the clear example of when he's playing basketball in the courtyard.
Bullying.
And they're separated. And they're just, with no, so they are not treated, they are citizens of France, but they are not treated as citizens of France. They're segregated, and for me, it made very much sense, his motivation to plant the bomb and to be loyal to this cause is that he has this experience, and the young Polish boy looks his witness to this experience. And then on top of that, his friend is killed. Yeah. And you see, and I think when you're seeing sobbing on the bed, I think that is the turning point.
Yeah, I agree.
Because he's reached a certain, and what I've seen in many, accounts of legitimation of violence in the Indonesian context, you see a legitimation of committing violence often after a subsequent experience of fierce injustice. So I'm allowed to take your lives because look at what you've done to me.
It's not that you justify it, but you understand the reasoning.
You're motivated because it's you can't. He actually says, "I can't look at myself in the mirror."
Yeah.
I think that's a key sentence. Yeah. Can you look yourself at the mirror? No. Most people shy away. And he said, no, I have to do something. And even, whereas it destroys her life, eventually she agrees with him. Yeah. And even he's planted a seed in the little boy.
Exactly. He's based on a real
yes, this is a real, and I think when did the film come out?
Last year.
Last year. Yeah. I'm sure they will trace him and interview. I'm very curious to know what became of him.
Yeah, definitely. And there is one reality as well, because now you're referring to the injustice he saw. But when at the introduction, he is introduced as coming from a communist family. I
Yeah.
think it's also important for his motives, and it's also important for the context of the independence war of France to Algeria and France, and the geopolitical arena. But also, actually, that was also in the Netherlands, in Indonesia. So maybe we can come
Yes.
back to that. But first, in this context of France and him being a communist, how did it play a role?
Well, it's you see that there is a transfer of values from generation to generation. So his life, his ideals, his frame is the struggle and being struggling and acting against oppression. And so from this perspective of unjustness and justness and being equal, he is but what is interesting is that initially you have this communist party in Algeria, so it isn't outrooted from the start. So it says that if you replicate France, you get everything. You can't sift out. So, and then gradually this becomes a problem.
And we're talking about 1956.
To 62, yes.
62 it starts, but
No. It ends.
Oh,
in
62. I'm sorry.
Yes,
Yeah.
It starts in and there again, when it starts and when it ends, both in Indonesia and are arbitraries. In retrospect, you say, oh, that was the first bombing, or that was a kind of uprising. Then we start there. But the idea of having a beginning and an end of a war is actually an old-fashioned way, because this is what wars were. You declared war and then you had a peace treaty. And, with guerrilla warfare, it's a bit different.
What's the essence of guerrilla warfare?
The essence of guerrilla warfare is that it's not, it's messy. Things happen unexpectedly. You don't know who did it because the subversive force is hidden. So it's uncontrollable. And if you compare it to the traditional war, the actual warfare is much less. It's incidents of, sudden. So therefore, it is hard to say there is, you could say there is a declaration of war. The fact that a group publicly calls the attention to declare independence may be seen as the start of a war, but it's different. Also, if you think of the remembrance, we have monuments all over the place about the Second World War. We have big remembrances. We have documentary series, but you don't have monuments that glorify the fact that you lost Vietnam, or that when the veterans succeed in portraying themselves as victims who need, then yes, but the fact itself. So remembrance of insurgency wars, of guerrilla are difficult, are more complex than the classic. But going back to where did we come to the guerrilla for?
I refer to him as becoming a part of the guerrilla warfare in Algeria and being a communist.
And so this is a feature. So he's not at all mainstream. If I think of the death sentences in Indonesia, there were also a whole death sentence. And there was a very famous called Walter Mongedizi, who was sentenced to death after the peace treaty.
But sentenced to death by?
By the Dutch. military
Yeah.
court
Again.
but you do have various Dutch military who desert and choose the Indonesian side. Piet van Staveren, but he limited itself to being a nurse, helping.
Yeah.
Whereas Ponke Prince,
Ponke Prince is famous. Yeah.
he was very active, and he's been a scapegoat of angry Dutch veterans because of this.
And a token of the Indonesian government.
Yeah. So but I have no knowledge of Indies person, important person, of having a symbolic place on the Indonesian side. There were many, people of mixed blood that chose for the Indonesian independence struggle. Very often people with a leftist. And the Communist Party, also you had Henk Sneevliet. So and I know of one, Joop Morian. He was a veteran, and at first he wanted to reject, to desert, he didn't want to go to Indonesia, but that would have meant prison in the Netherlands, and
he didn't want to conscript.
He didn't want to go to Indonesia, and the CPN party said to him, you are more effective if you go there and you spread amongst the military the knowledge about this war being unjust. And this is what he did. And in a very covert way. So he was very active during, and then he came back.
And when we're talking about, and when is it exactly?
We are talking about from 45 to 49. 1945.
So it's way earlier than this movie. But.
Yes. So this is immediately after the war.
Yeah, exactly. When the CPN was still was on the good side in the war.
Yes, it was on a good side. At the same time, the mobilization of political forces to engage in the Cold War was already going on. So there was the Russians helped us out, but at the same time there was a lot going on, and in Indonesia there was a very strong communist movement. There was a very strong Islam movement, and you had a nationalist movement, which was more Western oriented, and they fought with each other.
In what way?
Oh, because they fought within the independence war. There was a strife between the three groups.
Also with force?
Also with force. And the Dutch would just witness attacks from one side. And of course, this isn't a good story in the independence. But one of the things that Sukarno did, which was key for getting the trust and the support of the United States within the Cold War context, was suppress a communist uprising. And he succeeded in suppressing, and this gave him the ticket to international support. And it was so it took the course of control via the CIA, and then Sukarno regretted it and tried to pull off and try to have contacts with China and Russia, and then he was.
It was his downfall in the end.
It was his downfall in the end, and then
we're talking about Suharto, but it's
after Suharto. So you see how the fate of these independence movement and the country is also determined by the geopolitical. So you have in the post Indonesia, you have Cold War, NATO, EU building up. After the Algerian peace in '62, you're a step further than within that integration process. And one of the very characterization of these of the aftermath of these wars is the terminology. And Raphael Blanche, who is a specialist in Algeria, wrote a beautiful piece on what the language was that stayed. The context, the conflicts are different. They're in different times, in different contexts. But if you study the documents, if you hear the voices of the talks, you can see the terminology of counterinsurgency, which is later reflected in the war on terror. Algeria had their specialists, and they were flown out to South America, where they took up the methods that were applied in Algeria. So the special school that you had for people who tortured in Sahara, that they had these specialists from Algeria. Yes,
and they probably helped the populist right wing.
Well, then they were not on the set stage. They were back. These. It was educating military on how to do counterinsurgency,
exactly.
And this was at military academies, and this was, that's the places where Pinochet might be, and Noriega, and all that kind of.
So all backed up probably by the U.S. because it was all against communism.
So this knowledge was transferred to, and so you have the knowledge of the country, and then you have the language of the rebuilding the country, the language of the Cold War, the language of the EU reunited, of economic support, and the Marshall Plan is a stepping stone for all these, and NATO, of course.
What was the reaction towards France and their oppressing the uprising there? From Europe, from US, and if you compare it to the independence war in Indonesia, because I think you referred to it already, that the US was on the side of Sukarno, and that actually forced the Dutch out. We were not supported anymore.
Yeah.
So if you compare.
Well, I believe that the United States initially supported the French. But I have no knowledge of a similar as the suppression of the communist uprising in Indonesia. I have no knowledge.
And European countries like the Netherlands, how did we react to France and the images? Because there are images from the bloody oppression in Algiers.
Well, the strange thing is that when the Algerian war was on, the war reports about the fierceness of the Algerian war in the Dutch press on the left side, but no one connected it to their own history of the Netherlands. So, and this was also one of the reproaches of the first veteran who spoke out on television in 1969, Joop Huting. This is really a kind of key canonic moment. The television accounts about acts of crimes of war by someone who was there and who actually acknowledges he committed them. And he said, I'm sick and tired of reading about how awful Vietnam is and how terrible the French behaved in Algeria, and with no connection whatsoever with Indonesia. I was there. I know what happened. This must come out. And so this is this, it's not forbidden. No one, but we just don't talk about it. And it is, and in my PhD, I try to explain how this mechanism works.
Just a glimpse?
It's the consensus culture of the Netherlands, which is something of the past now. But it has for a very long time influenced and determined the way historical debates, there were hardly any historical debates, were discussed, how this played out in Dutch society. And there is a Dutch sociologist called Goudsblom who described it as the discretion of the leading class, which is, when the subject is difficult or might,
When it
might
stings.
hurt
Yeah.
something, let's stay calm. Let's just, as responsible people, see what we can do with it. So we have a commission and but things of outrage, scandal, that kind of, because there wasn't this right wing, left wing. So the debates in Italy, in Great Britain, in France are much harsher on these types of issues. They have become, in a way you could say, the Netherlands has become adult. On the other hand, I have very good memories of just talking to each other about your viewpoints instead of writing very angry.
What does it mean for the people who are really involved, the veterans, the people of Indonesia there, people who had to flee Indonesia because they were on the Dutch side, or people who with a troubled history? What was the effect of that?
And here I connect to my earlier description of the lexicon. A lot of these stories were subterranean. They were hidden. And it's because of the development of the historical practice of it has democratized. So in the 50s and 60s, the nation state and what the nation state does and the chronological of big events was the way in which you perceived history. And with microhistory, with oral history,
what is that microhistory?
Microhistory is that you don't look at the regional or the national level, but you look at the level of a family, of a village. It comes from anthropology. It's more so. So a micro, and you need very good sources to be able to do that.
And that's opposed to the political history.
Yes, so all these different kinds of history that evolved in the 60s and the 70s kind of gave way, made it possible, and the digital revolution as well, made it possible to have all these sub-narratives, and this is why history, the remembrance of these wars, has become complex, because when you hear one voice, one dominant voice, and the others, then you can accept that as history. When you have 10 or 20 or 25, and the concept of victim is transposed to any kind of suffering, then you have thousands of voices. But this is hard to teach at school because, you want a clear story. And it's also hard to describe diversity and complexity in journalism. One of the first things that you learn when you write a piece is you have to have a quote, you have to have a message, a key message that comes back, so that after reading this, it's very clear that you have a new position, a new view. But in order to do that, you have to rub away all the messiness. And so there is a contradiction between the dialectics of having new standpoints and being accurate and precise about what played. And you see this constant strain and tension between, if you want a new perspective, we can't sit here with 5 historians and say, it's a little bit this and it's a little bit that. You have to say, no, we are all traitors. These big words that they are irritating, but they do stir a new debate. So there is this constant tension. And the lexicon of the 90s and the digital revolution.
What do you mean by lexicon?
The lexicon, the how to say, the insieme, how to say,
the whole of the debate.
Encompassing debate words, terms,
Within the
images.
scientific
This is not necessarily only scientific. There is a scientific paradigm, but the thing, if you, for instance, for 10 years monitor all the headings in a newspaper, or the titles of current affair programs or documentaries, then you get a kind of lexicon. This comes again and again and again. So, and the one that is dominant, which put the war crimes in Indonesia on the political agenda after nearly 60 years, is the human rights lexicon. Because it was not the historians. Because how do you say, in order to mobilize political forces, historical problems have to have a political dimension, which creates pressure, and that politicians have to act. So if the judge has said that the Indonesian widows of Ravagede deserve compensation and apologies, then the Dutch government has a problem. It has to act. And from then on evolves all the dynamics of asking for a research, in-depth research, for having documentaries, for having teaching lessons at schools. And this is all because a judge chose. You see how this key event determines, and then you say, at last we have, we have elaborated on, but it's not a natural process.
And now is the historical debate and the debate in journalism has shifted since this Rawagade sentence?
Yes, has very much. I can say, because I'm old enough to have witnessed the first debates when I was writing my master thesis and compare it to now. And
what is the main difference for you?
The main difference is that it has become a political problem. It wasn't. The television series in '69, the apologies that were not given in 1995 by the Queen, they weren't strong enough to create a political problem. If an Indonesian person at the time would have sued a Dutch military because of his torture, because she became invalid or had been raped, or if that would have happened, and there would have been enough pressure, that would have had a chance. But this didn't happen because it was not on the agenda of the Indonesian government, because the Indonesian government knew very well that if matters were going to dig up,
also
that
the
their mess would also would also come up. So there was a gentleman's agreement between Indonesia and the Netherlands. We care for our veterans. We have a policy for the ones that are traumatized. We help them. We honor them. We give them apology, but we don't prosecute perpetrators. And it's a white spot. We haven't done this.
And coming back to Algeria and France, is that different?
In Algeria, there was a famous cause with General Ausure. He's a general who openly admitted and legitimated the use of torture.
In
Algeria.
No, what year?
This was around, I think, 2000.
Okay, yeah.
1999.
Quite recently.
Yeah. And so there was a host, but in France, it was a debate because very influential political intellectual figures like Simone de Beauvoir and Paul Sartre managed to get it on the agenda, and the FLN and people were very good at presenting, for instance,
the liberation movement,
the imprisonment of the women as something that would be picked up by the left-wing intellectual elite. and by the human rights discourse that was going on. So they were very effective in creating that sensibility. But in France, they managed to get to have amnesties, general amnesties for evidence. So there was no way of
prosecuting.
Of prosecuting but I know that for France, traumatized former conscripts are a far larger problem than it has been for Netherlands, just because of the scale, the millions of conscripts that were sent there.
And how many, opposed to how many to Indonesia?
220,000.
Yeah. Opposed to millions. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an incredible difference in scale, and I think that in the Algerian case, there still might be things that come out, or new publications or revelations.
One last short answer, please, because we have to wrap up. You told us about the organized torture, the training in the military in France and Algeria. Was it the same in the Netherlands? Because maybe
no.
So that depends on the.
There is a strange thing that the knowledge and know-how of Malaysia, the British, Algeria, I think also Northern Ireland. There is a kind of constellation, a connection between this and the torturing in the military regimes in Middle and South America. But the Dutch are not part of it. They're probably not knowledge. I think
We're
they
not
lose.
part of the complot.
No, they're not. They're not. Their knowledge and insights is not. I don't think it's relevant for secret services or for. So they're we're a little country.
So, and that refers to the scale as well, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. Could you give us a last thought for our audience, something to wrap up with, about everything we talked about?
Well, that is to rethink the use of nations when you tell a story about war, the Dutch and the Indonesian. That's such a simplification. And I'm not saying this because you have to have this academic view and complicity, but it's just ask around you, ask to grandmothers, grandfathers, uncles, and you will see that you can't portray
everyone
the
has his
conflict.
own story.
Yes, so it's but not in a sense of a platitude. Everyone has one story, but in a sense of try to engage in new forms of history, because the national tags is inappropriate, and it doesn't give a promise to the future.
I think that's a very good ending. Thank you, Stef, for being with us and enlightening us. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Please check our website for all the other wonderful documentaries, feature films, fiction films, and our in-depth programs, which I'm involved with. So thank you for listening, watching, and see you online. Thank you.